The rift in space remained open, its swirling tendrils of light pulsing like the heartbeat of some ancient and forgotten god. It stretched far across the desolate sector, unheeding of the war-torn systems surrounding it. Thousands of battle-damaged ships drifted aimlessly through the cold void, their crews too exhausted or too desperate to even engage in the ongoing struggle. Yet even in this dead silence, the sudden appearance of the rift was impossible to ignore. No one knew what caused it, nor who might come through it. The universe had seen countless anomalies in its time, but none like this. The air around it seemed to shimmer with a tension that felt both ancient and new, an energy that had been absent for eons. Across the galactic battlefield, the alien fleets, once proud and powerful, had already weathered an unimaginable toll. Each faction had been fighting for centuries, driven by the need to dominate, to outlast, to survive. But the war was unsustainable, a perpetual cycle of destruction that had reached its tipping point. Systems were collapsing, once thriving planets reduced to smoldering craters, their populations decimated by weapons of unimaginable horror. The flicker of the rift wasn't just a strange phenomenon. It was a beacon. The leaders of the largest factions had been locked in endless tactical debates for years, trying to carve out new territories, considering alliances with those they once regarded as enemies. But the arrival of something so massive, something that no faction had predicted, changed the nature of the conflict entirely. For the first time in eons, the warring factions ceased fire, their eyes now drawn to the impossible rift that seemed to swallow the stars. First, the only thing visible through the rift was the silhouette of ships, an endless armada, vast beyond measure. They hovered like a slow-moving storm on the horizon, moving with an eerie sense of purpose, but their speed was unrelenting. As they emerged further into the known space, the full scale of the fleet began to take shape. Their ships gleamed with dark metallic surfaces, adorned with patterns too complex to decipher. There were no visible weapons, no distinguishing marks or insignia, nothing that could tell which species or empire they belonged to. But one thing was clear: these ships were no ordinary fleet. And then came the sound. Wasn't a roar or a screech, but a deep resonating hum, a vibration that seemed to travel through the bones of those who could hear it, making the hairs on the backs of their necks stand on end. The galaxy's battle-hardened soldiers, the bravest of commanders, all felt the unease ripple through them. Some thought they were hearing a signal, an incoming transmission, but nothing came. Just the hum. A hum that hinted at a power beyond anything they had ever encountered. For a brief moment, time seemed to stand still. Among the factions, rumors began to spread. Some claimed the ships were sent by the gods, others whispered that they were the harbingers of the end times. Many dismissed them as just another anomaly, another short-lived disturbance in the chaotic void of war. But these whispers could not be ignored for long. The fleet grew, and as the stars around the rift began to flicker and distort, it became evident that these ships weren't just passing through, they were arriving. Fleets began to move to intercept, unsure whether they should engage or retreat. What did the humans want? Who were they? Were they a new power, or something far older than anyone had guessed? And why did they show up now? The largest of the fleets, led by the Rhaegar, one of the fiercest military leaders in the galaxy, was the first to act. He had conquered numerous systems and commanded a vast war machine, but the unknown quantity of the human fleet gnawed at him. His warships, heavily armored and bristling with weapons, advanced cautiously toward the rift. They opened communications, demanding identification, threatening action. His words echoed across the void. "This is your only warning. Identify yourselves or face the consequences." The silence was immediate. Then, finally, a response. A simple, steady message flooded the communication channels of every fleet in the vicinity. "We are the humans. The war ends now." The message was blunt, unrelenting in its certainty. There were no demands, no threats, just those 5 chilling words. A ripple ran through the alien fleet commanders, unsure how to respond. Some believed it was a trap, a feint meant to lull them into a false sense of security before launching an attack. Others considered it a power move, an attempt to unnerve them. But none of them were prepared for what happened next. The human fleet didn't move. They simply watched. They didn't advance. They didn't respond to the show of force from the alien fleets that were now positioning themselves, guns primed. For several moments, a haunting stillness filled the space between the fleets. It felt like the calm before a storm. Something big was coming, but what? And then, without warning, the first alien ship, a massive battleship armed to the teeth, unleashed its weaponry at the human fleet. In an instant, the ship was gone. No explosion. No debris. It simply ceased to exist, as though it had never been. There was no resistance, no retaliatory fire, just silence. The war had just changed forever. The alien fleet's reaction to the sudden obliteration was immediate. Panic, disbelief, and confusion rippled through every corner of the command decks. It was as if the very fabric of the universe had been torn open, and the laws of warfare no longer applied. The sheer magnitude of the destruction defied all logic. The ship, once brimming with its deadly weaponry, had vanished without a trace. No wreckage, no signs of battle, nothing. For the first time in centuries, the alien factions halted their fighting, their collective gaze shifting to the human fleet, still poised at the heart of the battlefield. The communication channels buzzed with frantic chatter. Strategists and commanders muttered in disbelief, while others screamed at their subordinates, demanding answers, seeking guidance. This was not a typical ambush. The human fleet had not even returned fire. The eerie silence stretched on, broken only by the hum of energy that still echoed through the void. Ships from every faction slowed their advance, hesitant to engage further. All of them, from the most fearsome warlords to the most calculating tacticians, faced an impossible question. How do you fight an enemy that doesn't fight back? In the quiet that followed, the alien warships, once so confident in their superiority, began to hesitate. They launched test signals, probing for weaknesses in the human fleet's defensive systems, attempting to provoke a response. But nothing came. It was as though the humans had no interest in combat, or worse, they simply didn't need to engage in battle at all. The alien leaders began to argue. Should they attack again? Should they retreat? Or perhaps, I thought, it was time for diplomacy. An hour passed, and the tension among the alien commanders reached a boiling point. They had no choice but to act, or risk appearing weak. A second fleet, this one far larger and more heavily armed, moved into position, its warships lined up in tight formation. They opened fire, releasing an armament of missiles and energy blasts, so overwhelming that they threatened to tear through space itself. It was an all-out assault. And again, nothing. This time, the human fleet didn't move at all, their ships hovering like sentinels in the void, impervious to the chaos around them. The alien weapons smashed against the invisible barrier that surrounded the human vessels. The energy blasts evaporated in mid-flight, leaving behind only the faintest traces of residual energy before it was absorbed by the human ship's shields that were unlike anything the galaxy had ever witnessed. The missiles, too, vanished before they could reach their targets, caught in some unseen, almost imperceptible force that rendered them useless. Still, the humans did not engage. In the command centers of the alien fleets, fear took root. What were they facing? A force that could simply erase them without a single shot being fired? What was their weakness? There had to be one. There was always a weakness. But no matter how hard they searched, the human ships showed no sign of vulnerability. The fleet seemed to have no limits. A next desperate move came from a coalition of three of the largest factions, the Sandori, the Vornak, and the Illithri. These factions had been fighting against each other for centuries, yet they now found themselves united in the face of this new, unimaginable threat. They sent a unified diplomatic envoy to the humans, demanding a ceasefire, begging for peace. The message was transmitted to the human fleet with all the formality they could muster. After a long silence, the humans responded, their voice calm, but carrying an unsettling weight. "We are not here for peace. We are here to end this." The reply hung in the air like a command, each word etched into the consciousness of those who heard it. There was no warmth in the message, no room for negotiation. The human fleet was not interested in mercy. They were interested in one thing only, stopping the galaxy's endless war. The alien leaders were stunned. They had expected diplomacy, some form of bargaining, a plea for coexistence. Instead, the humans had rejected all offers. In the silence that followed, some of the most senior alien leaders began to rethink their positions. The battlefield, their battlefield, was now being shaped by an unknown force, one that didn't care for politics or alliances or survival. Then, without warning, a new signal came from the human fleet. It wasn't a threat, nor was it an explanation. It was simply a display, a demonstration of their power for all to see. From the center of the fleet, a single human ship powered up its weapons. The energy signature from the ship pulsed and expanded, lighting up the dark space around it in brilliant flashes. The ship released a concentrated burst of energy, pure, undiluted power. It was like watching the very essence of a star collapse into a single moment of light, before it expanded outward at an unimaginable speed. The burst reached the closest alien ship within seconds, engulfing it. The ship didn't explode. There were no shattered remnants of metal. Instead, it vanished, as if it had been wiped from existence, leaving nothing behind. No trace, no debris. Not even the smallest fragment of what once was. The first time, the galaxy's warlords understood something terrible. The humans weren't just here to negotiate or to halt the war. They had come with a purpose. The battle had already been decided. The universe was about to be rewritten, and the humans were the authors. In the aftermath of the human fleet's display of power, the galaxy's once dominant factions stood at a precipice, unsure of how to proceed. For the first time in centuries, their confidence was shattered. The destruction of the alien warship and the ease with which it was done revealed the overwhelming might of the humans. Even those who had seen their fair share of wars, those who had survived the most brutal battles, found themselves recoiling in terror. The galaxy, once a stage for countless wars, was now the arena for something far greater, something beyond their comprehension. The alien fleets, previously united in their relentless pursuit of dominance, now found themselves fractured. Some leaders immediately called for retreat, urging their forces to regroup and rethink their strategies. Others suggested a show of force, an all-out assault in the hopes of overwhelming the human fleet with sheer numbers. But the more they thought about it, the more they realized the futility of their plans. Every tactic they had relied on for centuries seemed utterly useless in the face of an enemy whose strength defied all conventional understanding. The ships, the weapons, the very way the humans operated, none of it made sense. Nothing they had ever known in war could predict or counter what had just happened. The war rooms of every major alien faction, heated debates ensued. Commanders and diplomats clashed over their next move. Some factions advocated for diplomacy, insisting that they must try to communicate with the humans, to negotiate a peaceful resolution before more lives were lost. But others, less inclined to weakness, argued that capitulating to the humans would mean surrendering their authority, their way of life. If they showed fear, if they bent the knee, their entire dominance over the galaxy would collapse. They could not afford to allow the humans to dictate the future of the cosmos. The middle of all this uncertainty, the most powerful voices in the galaxy, the Council of the Galactic Powers, convened. Leaders from each faction arrived in their grandest ships, each hoping to find a way to turn the tide in their favor. The council chamber was a sprawling, marble-like structure located at the heart of the neutral space, where no one faction could claim dominance. The room was filled with murmurs, with advisors exchanging whispered words, and all eyes were fixed on the holographic projections of the human fleet looming over the room. Kula 1, the leaders of the factions took their seats at the long round table. The mood was somber, grave, as if the weight of the universe itself had settled on their shoulders. The high-ranking representatives from the Xerix Empire, the Livan Consortium, and the Tehoran Dominion were present, along with a handful of smaller factions whose power had diminished over the years. The question that hung in the air was simple. What now? The Xerix ambassador, the most vocal of the council, stood first. "We cannot afford to ignore this threat any longer," he said, his voice steady but filled with a growing sense of dread. "If these humans are as powerful as they seem, we must act swiftly. We cannot allow them to take control. We have fought for centuries to carve out our empires. We will not let it be erased by a single fleet." But the Livan representative, his long, reptilian fingers tapping nervously on the table, shook his head. "We are not dealing with ordinary beings. They have weapons that can erase entire ships without so much as a detonation. This is not something we can defeat with firepower. We must understand them, find out what they want." His words were met with skepticism. The Xerix ambassador dismissed the idea with a wave of his hand. "You want to talk to them? They have already shown their power. They don't care for diplomacy. This is an invasion, pure and simple. If we don't strike now, we will lose everything." At this, the Tehoran leader, a tall, silver-skinned being, spoke for the first time. "I agree with the Livan, but we must approach this carefully. If they wanted to destroy us, they would have done so already. Their actions suggest they are here for something more than just conquest. The room fell silent as his words sank in. It was a subtle shift in the conversation, but it carried weight. Perhaps these humans were not simply invaders, nor conquerors in the traditional sense. Perhaps there was a greater purpose behind their arrival, one that even the most seasoned military minds could not fathom. The debate continued for hours, with the factions pulling in every expert they had, consulting their most advanced technologies, scrambling to find any clue as to who these humans were and what they wanted. Some factions still clung to the idea of force, unable to relinquish their pride. Others, recognizing the futility of that path, reluctantly agreed to send emissaries, diplomats, and negotiators to speak with the humans. But the humans did not respond. Every attempt at communication was met with silence. The humans were not willing to engage. They had no need for diplomacy, no desire for peace talks. The galaxy's leaders were left with only one undeniable truth. The humans had come not to negotiate or to conquer, but to end the war. And they had the power to do so with one simple act. It gripped the galaxy's leaders as they realized they had reached the end of an era. The old ways of war, the strategies that had defined the cosmos for so long, were now irrelevant. There was no more time for posturing. There was no more time for politics. The human fleet stood as an immovable force, and all the galaxy could do now was watch. As the days passed, the galaxy's leaders, overwhelmed with fear and uncertainty, found themselves scrambling to understand the nature of the humans who had appeared so suddenly. Desperation drove them to explore every avenue, seeking knowledge from every source, even those that had been long disregarded. Rumors that had once seemed like myths resurfaced, whispers of a forgotten civilization, a race that had vanished centuries ago. Some said the humans had once been the architects of the galaxy's most advanced technologies. Others claimed they had invented the weapons that sparked the wars, only to disappear into the depths of space before anyone could learn the full extent of their creations. But now, these whispers took on an urgent tone. The galaxy was no longer at war with one another, at least not for the moment, but the unsettling truth began to spread. The human fleet, silent and implacable, had not appeared out of nowhere. They had returned, and their return was not a coincidence. One faction, the Xeltha Dominion, had secretly begun to probe the ancient archives, scouring through lost records of history that had been hidden for centuries. Their best minds had uncovered long-buried evidence that the humans had been involved in the creation of the first intergalactic weapons, massive planet-shattering forces that had been wielded in the galaxy's earliest wars. These weapons, born of human genius, had been responsible for the rise of the galactic conflict, and their development had pushed the galaxy into an age of violence and domination. But after the First Great War, the humans disappeared. Their technology was scattered, lost to time, and their fleets vanished into the void. Now, a terrifying revelation began to emerge. The human fleet wasn't a random occurrence. They weren't just some unknown race emerging from the shadows. They were the architects of the war itself. A transmission broadcasted across every communication channel, instantly reaching all factions. The message was chilling in its simplicity, its clarity. A voice, calm and authoritative, resonated through the galaxy's transmission networks. We are the humans. We are the creators of the weapons that brought this galaxy to the brink. We are the ones who set these events in motion. We have returned to prevent the final destruction of all that we built. The war ends now. All systems will be accounted for. The words hit like a thunderclap. Every faction, every leader, every commander felt the weight of the revelation. The war that had consumed their civilizations for eons, the very war they had fought and bled for, was the result of human hands. They had been playing with forces beyond their understanding, with weapons that had been made by an extinct race. The implications were staggering. All their power, for all their technological advancements, none of the factions had ever considered that they were merely pawns in a game set in motion long before they had risen to power. The humans weren't some far-off conquerors. They were the true originators of the galaxy's conflict. And now they had come to put an end to it. A sense of panic spread through the war-torn galaxy. Leaders convened in emergency sessions, trying to piece together what the humans' return meant for them. If the humans had truly been the creators of the galaxy's most destructive technologies, what other horrors had they unleashed? Could the humans be trusted? Or were they a threat even more terrible than the factions had ever imagined? Despite the fear, some of the galaxy's more pragmatic factions attempted to calm the rising tide of panic. The Vornak High Command issued a statement to all systems. We are not alone in the universe. The humans have returned, but we must work with them, not against them. We will not let our fear guide us. But the Seltha, having uncovered even deeper secrets, knew better. Their research had uncovered more than just the fact that the humans had created the first weapons of mass destruction. They had learned that the humans were not simply gone for centuries. They had left the galaxy, but they had not left it without a plan. Their disappearance had been voluntary, an exodus meant to shield the rest of the galaxy from the darker aspects of their power. The humans had foresight that allowed them to see the inevitable consequences of their own creations. The galaxy had spiraled into chaos, and it was no accident. The humans had set the galaxy on this path, but now they were back to prevent it from consuming everything. The Seltha sent a message to all factions, urging caution. The humans have returned not as liberators, but as wardens. They were the architects of our suffering. They will not forgive our actions. The war has ended, but not because they desire peace. They will punish those who remain unrepentant. This chilling warning sent waves of fear throughout the galaxy. The humans were not here to negotiate or to rebuild. They were here to judge. They were here to determine the fates of the factions that had waged war in the galaxy for so long. The old, arrogant belief that they controlled the galaxy had crumbled with the humans' arrival. Now the factions had only one question to answer. Would they submit to the judgment of the humans, or would they face obliteration? The once proud warlords, who had commanded fleets and laid waste to entire planets, now found themselves the subjects of a cosmic reckoning. They had been outplayed, their grand ambitions shattered by the very beings who had unknowingly given birth to the war they had fought so hard to win. The galaxy was not what it had been. It was now something else entirely. And the humans, cold and unyielding, were watching. The galaxy's pulse quickened with every passing day. The human fleet, vast and untouchable, loomed over the stars, its ships silent and still. For weeks there had been no movement from them, no demands, no further demonstrations of their power, just the overwhelming presence, a reminder of their authority. The factions, once at each other's throats in their desperate struggle for supremacy, found themselves paralyzed by the weight of the humans' return. The old rivalries and alliances seemed insignificant now. In the face of this new, incomprehensible power, the galaxy stood on the edge of an abyss. The first step toward resolving the crisis came when the Council of Galactic Powers convened once more. This time, the mood was different. The desperation had turned to resignation. The human fleet had shown no signs of aggression beyond their initial display of overwhelming might, but the threat still hung over them like a dark cloud. No one knew what the humans truly wanted, but one thing was clear. The old order was finished. The war was over, and there was no turning back. For the first time in centuries, the factions stopped their bickering and sat in uneasy silence, each of them forced to confront the gravity of their situation. The Seltha, the Vornak, the Tehoran, and others were all represented, leaders and strategists alike, each one seeking a way forward, unsure if diplomacy could still save them. The Xerix ambassador, known for his ruthless pragmatism, spoke first. "We can no longer pretend that we control our fates. The humans are not here for peace. They never were. They are here to end this, our war. And we are the ones who will be judged." The room fell silent at his words, the stark reality of them sinking into the minds of all who heard. The Xerix were no strangers to war, but this was unlike anything they had faced. They were used to fighting battles they could win, using tactics honed through centuries of experience. But here the rules had changed. A representative from the Livan Consortium, a race known for their diplomatic prowess, quickly countered. "We must still approach them cautiously. We cannot assume they will simply destroy us without a reason. There must be a way to negotiate with them, to understand their purpose. If we show submission now, they may only see us as weak, and that will spell our doom. What if it's already too late for negotiation?" Another leader, the Tehoran, chimed in, their voice laced with fear. "What if the judgment has already begun, and we are simply too blind to see it?" Their words cut through the room like a cold wind. The Tehoran had always been a cautious race, unwilling to take risks. But even they could sense the looming catastrophe. The idea that the humans might already have passed judgment on the galaxy, that the wheel of fate had already turned beyond their control, sent a shiver through those gathered. The implications were more terrifying than any weapon they had ever wielded. But, despite their fear, a faction of leaders, chiefly from the Seltha, insisted that they should not surrender so easily. The Seltha, who had long prided themselves on their technological superiority and fierce independence, felt that submitting to the humans' judgment was anathema to their very being. They demanded that the galaxy fight back, organize one final stand against the humans, and prove that they still had the strength to survive. "We are not children to be scolded and cowered into submission." That Seltha leader roared, pounding his fist on the table. "If the humans believe they can simply erase us from existence, they are gravely mistaken. We will show them the true power of this galaxy, and we will not bend to their will." But the tension in the room only deepened. The more that Seltha and others argued for defiance, the more it became apparent that the reality of the situation was shifting. The human fleet had demonstrated that power could be wielded without firing a single shot. The galaxy had no counter for that kind of force. Before the debate could escalate further, a transmission burst through the room's communication channels, a direct line from the human fleet. It was not a message of destruction or conquest. It was, in a sense, the opposite. "The time has come to decide your fate," the voice said, calm but unyielding. It was the same voice that had delivered their earlier message, and it was clear that the humans were ready to move forward. We will begin the reckoning. The judgment of each faction will be individual and absolute. You will have no choice but to accept what is delivered. This is not an attack. It is your final chance to decide how you will be remembered. The transmission ended, leaving nothing but silence in its wake. The factions exchanged uneasy glances, each one understanding the gravity of the moment. This was no longer about winning or losing a war. It was about survival, about how they would be remembered in the history of the universe. The humans had given them a final opportunity, not for peace, but for resolution. The Telthar ambassador stood once more, his expression grim but resolute. This is no longer a question of war or peace. This is a question of whether we will continue to exist as we are. We have only one choice now: submit to the humans' judgment or face annihilation. The galaxy's leaders sat back in their chairs, the weight of their decisions pressing down on them like a collapsing star. Their empires, their legacies, all lay in the hands of the humans. The reckoning had begun. The galaxy held its breath as the countdown to the reckoning began. Across the vast stretches of space, the communication lines hummed with a new kind of urgency. The first time, the factions of the galaxy weren't preparing for battle, but for judgment. The humans had made it clear there would be no negotiation, no more games of politics. What came next would determine the fate of each faction, and the outcome was beyond their control. The Council of Galactic Powers had barely finished their tense debate when a series of energy pulses reverberated through space, unmistakably signaling the beginning of the reckoning. Each faction felt the tremor of the cosmic forces at work, as though the universe itself had begun to shift. The Telthar, the Vornak, the Tehoran, and all others now found themselves in the grip of something far greater than any war they had ever waged. The humans were not merely playing with their lives. They were rewriting the laws of existence itself. On the bridge of the human flagship, Admiral Tessa Harrow watched the unfolding events with a detached sense of purpose. Unlike the chaos unfolding across the galaxy, she and her fleet felt a cold certainty. Their mission was clear, their purpose immutable. The reckoning was not a punishment, nor was it a display of unchecked rage. It was the necessary consequence of a civilization that had gone too far, too deep into the abyss of self-destruction. But even within the ranks of the humans, there were whispers, not of doubt, but of wonder. How had it come to this? How had a species so seemingly insignificant become the arbiter of the galaxy's future? These questions lingered in the back of Tessa's mind, but she knew better than to question the larger purpose that had driven them. The humans were the galaxy's original architects, the creators of the very technologies that had ignited the endless wars. They had witnessed the inevitable destruction of the universe they had helped build and had chosen to step away, until now. As the countdown approached zero, the human fleet split into several divisions, each moving toward the core worlds of the most powerful factions. The Vornak homeworld, once a proud bastion of war and order, was the first to feel the arrival of the human judgment. The massive human ships came to a halt in orbit above the planet, their sheer presence casting a shadow across the surface. The Vornak, who had once stood as the mightiest of the galaxy's powers, found themselves powerless against the human fleet's advanced technology. Vornak leadership had no choice but to comply with the humans' terms. Their once impenetrable fortresses and battle stations, capable of withstanding even the most devastating attacks, were now reduced to nothing more than hollow monuments to their past glory. As the human fleet deployed drones and automated systems, the Vornak were faced with a choice: submit or face obliteration. The decision was made within hours. The Vornak, long known for their martial pride, sent a delegation to the human flagship. There would be no resistance. There would be no war. They would accept the reckoning. On the surface of the planet, the people of the Vornak stood in silence as their leaders delivered the message of submission to the humans. Their once mighty empire, with its vast fleets and warlords, had been brought to its knees without a single shot fired. The Vornak, for all their strength and military prowess, had learned the hard way that there was always something greater than force. The Tehoran Dominion, a race of strategic minds and calculating diplomats, prepared to make their move. Their approach was different, cautious, but no less grave. The Tehoran had long prided themselves on their intellect and their ability to outmaneuver their enemies through cunning and diplomacy. But as the human fleet descended upon their system, they quickly realized that no amount of negotiation could alter their fate. The Tehoran had built their empire on manipulation, on trade agreements, and shifting allegiances. But this time there were no cards to play, no strings to pull. The Tehoran offered their surrender, their representatives speaking to the human fleet with reverence, their voices heavy with the knowledge that the galaxy as they knew it was ending. There would be no more war, no more alliances. The reckoning was not just about the fate of the factions. It was about the galaxy itself, and the balance that had been thrown into chaos by the arrogance of those who thought they could control it. As the humans moved on to the next system, the Livan Consortium, once the diplomats of the galaxy, masters of communication and subtlety, waited. They had hoped that the other factions' submissions might buy them time, that they might find some loophole, some opportunity to avoid the consequences of their own actions. But deep down, the Livan knew what they had to do. The reckoning had already begun for them, as it had for the others. They sent their emissaries to the human fleet, but they too knew that this would not be a typical diplomatic exchange. No matter how well they could speak, no matter how much influence they had wielded in the past, the Livan understood that words would no longer carry weight in a galaxy defined by a new, unyielding power. It was a humbling realization for a species that had once relied on their words to shape the very course of history. And so it went, the reckoning sweeping across the galaxy. Factions that had once clashed with each other, some seeking to dominate, others to endure, now found themselves united under the cold gaze of the humans. The fear and uncertainty that had once driven them to violence was replaced by a single, undeniable truth. The humans were not simply masters of war. They were the arbiters of a new order. In the center of it all, the human fleet moved relentlessly forward. There were no cheers, no celebrations. The reckoning was not an end. It was a beginning. The beginning of a galaxy that would be shaped, not by endless war, but by something else. Something no one, not even the humans themselves, could yet fully comprehend. As the reckoning continued to unfold, the galaxy's vast empires, once towering monuments of power and conquest, began to crumble under the weight of humanity's unyielding judgment. No sooner had one faction submitted than another fell in line, each faced with the unavoidable realization that their time of dominance was over. The remnants of old alliances became meaningless as the human fleet advanced, a harbinger of a new order that none could escape. The vastness of space, once a battlefield for the ambitious and the ruthless, had transformed into an open stage for humanity's power to be realized. That Tseltha, the final holdout, tried to mount a resistance. They had seen the Vornak and Tehoran capitulate without so much as a fight, and they had watched as the Livan attempted, and failed, to use their diplomacy to sway the humans. That Tseltha believed themselves the last faction strong enough to defy the inevitable. Their fleet, advanced and ruthless, would be their final stand. But as their forces engaged the human fleet in a desperate attempt to assert some form of control, they were met with a force more profound than they could have ever imagined. The humans didn't respond with brute force. No massive show of destruction or obliteration. Instead, they used something far more devastating: manipulation of the very fabric of space itself. The Tseltha flagship, once a symbol of military superiority, found itself trapped in an artificial gravitational field. The energy surrounding the ship twisted and warped the very space around it. The Tseltha fleet found itself unable to move, their ships locked in place, their every maneuver countered with effortless precision. The fleet commanders, once proud of their tactical genius, suddenly found themselves helpless, their actions reduced to nothing more than futile attempts at escape. The bridge of the flagship, Tseltha commanding Admiral Verak, watched in horror as his once mighty fleet was rendered inert. He turned to his officers, searching for answers, but none came. "What are they doing? How do they do this?" he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. The humans, it seemed, had mastered control of the fundamental forces of the universe in ways that the Tseltha couldn't fathom. The concept of a gravitational weapon had existed in their science for millennia, but to wield such power on a galactic scale was something beyond their reach. The Tseltha had based their entire empire on their technological superiority, their ability to outmaneuver and outfight their enemies. But now they had been reduced to nothing more than prey before a force they couldn't even begin to understand. The Tseltha fleet was rendered immobile. The human fleet did not engage in the annihilation they had so often wielded in their past conflicts. Instead, they sent a singular ship toward the Tseltha flagship. On board, a single figure, Admiral Tessahara, approached the wrecked vessel, the only sign of communication being a short, cryptic transmission that followed her arrival. "Your empire is ended," the transmission began, her voice calm yet authoritative. "You were the last to resist. This is your reckoning. There will be no more war, no more suffering." Ark stood in silence, the weight of the words sinking in. He had lived his life on the belief that there would always be a way to fight back, always a way to overcome. And yet here he was, at the mercy of those he had once considered insignificant, those he had believed were mere children in the grand game of galactic conquest. The human ship floated alongside the Tseltha flagship, and Tessa's image appeared on the main screen. "You will live, but you will never rule again. You will submit to our judgment, and your civilization will begin again, this time on the terms of those who remain." A long, painful silence followed. The Tseltha fleet remained trapped, helpless in the artificial gravity field. Their resistance had failed before it had even begun. There was no last-ditch attempt, no hidden weapon or secret alliance to save them. The Tseltha had been given a choice, and they had failed to make it. Across the galaxy, similar events unfolded. The Vornak, whose military machine had once been unstoppable, now found themselves abandoned to the judgment of the humans. Their grand capital city, once gleaming with the gold of centuries of conquests, now lay in ruins, not by the hand of the humans directly, but by the simple fact of their unyielding presence. The Vornak leadership capitulated within hours, unwilling to witness the further degradation of their people. Meanwhile, the Teheran, the once calculating masterminds of diplomatic maneuvering, now stood at the mercy of their own intelligence. The idea that they could think their way out of this crisis had been crushed by the cold, unyielding logic of the humans. It was a humbling reality for the race that had once prided itself on its superior intellect. As the reckoning spread through the galaxy, the effects rippled outward. Entire systems fell silent as their leaders either submitted to the humans' will or faced oblivion. The old structures of power, the old wars that had once defined the fabric of existence, were being erased. The galaxy was shifting into something new, something terrifyingly unknown. No one knew what would come next, but it was undeniable that the reckoning had fundamentally altered the balance of the cosmos. Even those who had once stood on the fringes of galactic politics felt the changes. Minor factions, once content to carve out their own small territories, now found themselves caught in the wake of the larger empire's destruction. Some sought refuge, others prepared for their own reckoning, but none could escape the truth. The galaxy's new rulers were not those who had once controlled the stars. They were the humans, the architects of the cosmic reset. The galaxy was no longer a place of endless war. It had become a place of judgment, and for all who had risen on the backs of war, their time was over. As the reckoning reached its zenith, a profound stillness settled across the galaxy. The chaotic hum of interstellar conflict, the roar of battles fought on 1,000 fronts, had fallen silent. For the first time in eons, the stars did not burn with the fires of war. There was no grand celebration of victory, no cheers, no banners waving. Instead, there was an eerie, almost solemn quiet. The galaxy, or what was left of it, stood in the shadow of a new era. The human fleet, stationed at the heart of it all, maintained its silent vigil. Their ships, massive and unyielding, hovered over worlds that had once been centers of power, now reduced to quiet, unspoken waiting rooms for what would come next. The reckoning had not been a war to win or lose. It had been a judgment that reshaped the very nature of existence in the galaxy. And now, with the last of the factions either submitted or annihilated, the humans could finally begin their work. Admiral Tessaharo stood on the bridge of the flagship, watching as the lights of distant worlds twinkled in the darkness. She had seen the fall of empires, the collapse of thousands of years of conflict, and the surrender of entire species. Yet, as she observed the vast emptiness that followed, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. What had started as an intervention, a simple reckoning of a war-torn galaxy, had evolved into something much greater. The humans had not just defeated the factions of the galaxy, they had erased the old paradigm entirely. Tessa turned to the command crew, a group of humans who shared the same understanding of the task at hand. Their mission had always been one of redemption, not of conquest, but of restoration. The galaxy, having once fallen into the throes of endless conflict, needed guidance. Needed leadership to heal, to rebuild from the ground up. The reckoning had proven that, without intervention, the galaxy was on a path to self-destruction. And the humans, the very ones who had ignited this cycle of chaos, were now its only salvation. "What happens now?" Lieutenant Commander Lyra asked, her voice filled with a mixture of uncertainty and hope. Tessa didn't answer immediately. She understood the magnitude of the question. The galaxy, for all its endless complexity, had been reduced to a single truth. The humans had the power to shape it. The factions that once dominated the stars were no more. The human fleet had already sent out the first wave of peacekeepers, small teams of specialists who would descend onto the former capitals of the major factions to begin the delicate work of rebuilding. The process was not going to be quick. It would take years, perhaps centuries, to restore the fabric of society that had once thrived, but the journey had begun. Now, Tessa said finally, we rebuild. We show them that they are not the remnants of their old selves. They are something new, and we will guide them. Reckoning had not been about punishment. It had been about breaking down the old entrenched systems of violence and inequality and forging something that could stand the test of time. The humans were not a new empire. No, they were something different. They were the keepers of a new galaxy, not ruled by fear, but by cooperation, respect, and a shared understanding that the cycle of war must end. As the fleet spread out, the first systems to be visited by the humans were those that had been hardest hit during the war. The Vornak homeworld, once a center of military prowess and unyielding dominance, now lay in ruins. The humans had not destroyed it, but they had forced the Vornak to look at the cost of their existence. The surviving Vornak leaders had already begun the long road to acceptance, acknowledging that their time of dominance had passed. The Livan, once known for their delicate diplomacy, had lost much of their influence. Yet, the guidance of the humans, they began to rediscover their role in the new galaxy. Their intelligence networks were repurposed for the greater good, focused now on spreading knowledge and communication rather than manipulation. The Tahoran, proud of their intellect and tradition, found themselves humbled by the reckoning, but ultimately receptive to the human message. They were tasked with teaching the galaxy the art of cooperation, something they had once believed could only be achieved through dominance of the mind. Their new role as mentors of unity allowed them to rediscover the power of their intellect for the greater good, rather than as a weapon. And the Zeltha, who had once resisted the humans with everything they had, found a place in this new world. Their technological prowess was not discarded. Instead, they were now working alongside the humans to develop innovations for the future, guided by a new purpose. They would no longer wield their weapons for destruction, but for creation. The once unstoppable warlords, now rendered powerless, found themselves adrift in a galaxy they could no longer control. But as they worked alongside the humans, they began to understand that there was a greater form of strength than the power to destroy. There was strength in compassion, in rebuilding what had been broken, in leading by example. In the distance, the stars still twinkled, unchanged by the reckoning, but the galaxy beneath them was a different place now. It was still recovering, still adapting to the seismic changes that had reshaped it. Some whispered that the reckoning had been too harsh, that the humans had overstepped their bounds, and that the galaxy would never be the same. But in the quiet moments between the chaos, when the last of the old ways were buried and the first glimmers of cooperation began to shine through, a new hope started to emerge. The reckoning was not the end. It was a beginning. The galaxy had been broken, but now it had a chance to heal, one world, one species, one step at a time. And humanity, the architects of its redemption, would guide it to a future unlike anything the stars had ever known.